All right, it looks like it's just after 10 o'clock. I think we can get started here. Good morning, everyone. It's time for another DWD webinar. Today, we're going to talk about the executive director. A couple topics that Carrie's going to touch on are the board and the ED relationship, some of the ED's key responsibilities, and big one, succession planning. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to introduce our not-for-profit team. My name is Tyson Moore. I'm an accounting supervisor in the not-for-profit division here at DWD. Joining me today are directors Phil McKenzie and Susan Berghoff, along with our presenter and Carrie Minnick. Now, before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to go over. This webinar is live and it's interactive. So for those of you who have questions during the webinar, please use Zoom's question and answer feature. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen on the toolbar. We will be answering questions throughout the presentation. Also, Carrie's slides will be emailed to everyone attending the webinar today, along with being posted to our website. All right, with that being said, I'll turn the floor over to Carrie to get started.
Thanks, Tyson. Today, we're going to talk about the executive director. Before we get started, I just want to make it clear that when we refer to executive director, this could be your CEO, your president, or your president CEO. So whatever you call this individual, we're talking today about the top person that is leading and in charge of your daily operation. So we're not going to get into, what terminology you should call them, whether it should be executive director, CEO, or president. We're mainly talking about that position. So I'm going to use the terminology executive director, but you might be calling this person a CEO or a president. And let's just start with the basic relationship. So we have our board of directors. The board is ultimately responsible for the organization. So as a group, they are responsible for the nonprofit organization. The executive director reports to the board. The board of directors does not report to the executive director. So that is important to keep that in mind. I know sometimes the relationship can get kind of muddy between the two as to who does what, and we'll talk about that. But just as we go through this, the executive director is reporting to the board of directors. So we have our board of directors, the executive director, and then we have all of our staff. Now, I do realize that some organizations, some nonprofits are completely volunteer run, so they might not have an executive director, or maybe you just have an executive director and not a staff, or you have a very small staff. But the point here is, again, the board of directors is ultimately responsible for the organization. The executive director reports to that board, and then all of the staff doing the daily operations, they are reporting to the executive director, not to the board of directors. So let's talk about the board's role. If we go and refer to board sources, 10 basic responsibilities, there are 3 specific board roles that relate to the executive director: selecting the executive director, supporting the executive director, and evaluating the executive director. So if we look at the first one, selecting the executive director, the board needs to review the organization's current strengths and needs when determining who needs to be brought in to fill that executive director position. Now, whether this be a brand new nonprofit that's just starting up, or your executive director is getting ready to retire and you're looking for a new one, where the organization is at in its life cycle and what it needs is going to depend on what type of person you bring in. Maybe you're at a point where you really need to do some more fundraising, and maybe you need to have a person in that leadership position that has some fundraising experience. Or maybe you're at a point where you really need to focus on your programs, and so you need to have a leader of the organization that has more strengths and experience with programming. So again, based on the organization's current situation, life cycle, where it's at, what's going on, is going to determine what type of person is going to fill that executive director role. And along with that, you really need to establish those organization priorities. So like I said, is it focusing on fundraising? We really need to get some new funders in here, or is it we really need to evaluate the programs? So again, those priorities are going to impact what kind of person comes in and fills that leadership role. As the board, you really need to come up with a list of skills and characteristics that are needed. You're going to need to have a job description when you bring this person in to know what you're looking for. Establishing clear expectations for service is a key one, and we'll talk about that a little bit later about the differences between what the executive director does versus what the board does. Providing an adequate compensation package. So for their services, you're going to need to obviously pay them a salary, but what other kind of benefits are they going to be receiving? Providing an environment to succeed. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about supporting the executive director. And then again, clarifying the functions of the executive director versus the board. So when we talk about the executive director versus the board of directors, there's a few main responsibilities, overall responsibilities of an organization. And then those are kind of divided between what the executive director does versus what the board does. So the first is strategic planning. So obviously the organization should have a strategic plan in place to know where it's going and how it's going to get there. The board plays its role in this by actually participating and developing strategy and making sure that the organization is moving towards those goals and vision, that it is following its mission statement. The executive director is going to actually carry out the plan that the board develops. Hiring, again, the board hires only one employee, that is the executive director. The executive director hires and manages staff. I know sometimes it gets very tempting, or there are some boards that try and go and kind of get in more into the weeds and get into managing the staff, and that's really not how it should be. The board has only one staff to be responsible for, and that's the executive director. As far as governance, the board is obviously the one that's governing the organization, and there are clear fiduciary duties that the board of directors have. The duty of care, making sure that there's prudent use of the organization's assets. Duty of loyalty, making decisions in the best interest of the organization. And duty of obedience, ensuring that the organization follows all of the laws and regulations. The executive director really serves as a liaison between the board and staff. Yes, the executive director is usually at the board meetings. However, they probably don't have a voting right, but they are there to give updates on what's going on within the organization and to be that connection between the staff, the everyday duties versus the governing board. Financial responsibility. The board is responsible for ensuring that there's adequate financial resources that are available for the organization to carry out their duties, their mission, their programs, and also to make sure that those funds are managed effectively. The executive director is then responsible for the day-to-day activities, spending those funds, raising those funds, making sure that those the budget is being followed, that those resources are being used as appropriate. And then finally, fundraising, which I know many board members or sometimes board members don't like to get involved in fundraising, but really that should be part of your duty as a board member. So participating in those fundraising efforts, providing financial support, whether it be you personally or the organization or company that you're with, or inviting your friends to or colleagues to participate in different fundraising events for the organization. While the ED is the one, again, that's actually getting down into the everyday logistics and efforts to do fundraising. So you can see that the executive director and the board of directors must work together in a lot of areas. The relationship between the board and especially the board chair and the executive is very important. Obviously, these groups need to work together for the organization to succeed. So on the screen, I put a list of some responsibilities within an organization. And if you just take a minute here and look over this list and think about which one of these do you think are duties of the executive director versus which ones do you think are more of board of directors responsibilities. So if you just look at these for a minute and think which one you think they fall under. Okay, so I have put the answers in red. So as you can see, what we talked about, the board mainly governs the organization. They're also going to be the ones that amend the bylaws, approve the budget. They provide legal oversight, financial oversight. Specifically recruiting board members. I know in many organizations that falls on the executive director, but really the board is ultimately responsible for recruiting board members. The board also is responsible for leading board meetings, so that chair of the board, I know sometimes the executive director, that kind of falls on them, but really that is the job of the board chair. And then also creating the board agenda are the board responsibilities. Now, obviously, in some of these instances, the board chair is going to get assistance from the executive director, but the primary responsibility does fall on the board. While on the other side, the executive director, they are really responsible for the everyday operations, managing staff, developing policies and programs. Now, obviously, some of those policies need to be approved by the board, but the ED is responsible for making sure that those are developed. And then obviously we have some instances where there's shared responsibilities, the strategic planning, the fundraising that we've talked about before. So as well as the board sources 10 basic responsibilities for nonprofit boards, they also have 10 basic responsibility for a nonprofit chief executive. So if you haven't, or if you're not familiar with Board Source or these 10 basic responsibilities, I encourage you to visit their website to get into these a little bit more in depth. We're just going to briefly go over each of these. Commit to the mission. Obviously, if they're leading the organization, they really have to have a strong belief in what the organization is doing. Leading the staff, managing the organization. Again, that's the everyday operations of the organization. Exercising responsible financial stewardship. That's the money, making sure that, the money is coming in and that it's being spent accordingly, responsibly. Leading and managing fundraising. Now, obviously, you might have a development director, a fundraising department to assist you with that, but the executive director is ultimately responsible for that. Following the highest ethical standards, ensuring accountability and complying with law. Obviously, we want to make sure that all of the 990 and any other reports that need to be filed are filed properly. As a charitable organization, as a tax exempt organization, making sure that we're following all the requirements to maintain that status. Engaging the board in planning and leading implementation, developing future leadership within the organization, the vice presidents or the second level of reporting to the executive director, getting those people up and getting the education and the leadership that they need to succeed. Building external relationships and serving as an advocate. I think this is a big one. Normally, the executive director is very active in the community, making sure that the community is aware of what the organization is doing. Ensuring the quality and effectiveness of the programs, and then obviously supporting the board. So again, the board executive director relationship working together. So the second responsibility of the board related to the executive director is to support the executive director. So once you've hired that person and brought them in, we need to support them in their position. So some of the things that you can do as a board member to support the executive director, or as an executive director, maybe these are some things that you can kind of mention to your board that would be helpful. Attend all board meetings, be on time and be prepared. Make sure you read the documents, the agenda, the minutes, make sure you read all of that before you come to the meeting. So that way, when you come to the meeting, you can actively participate in any discussions. Ask questions, again, be actively involved within the organization. Participate in the annual evaluation process. We're going to talk about evaluating the executive director a little bit later, but as a board member, it's very important that you provide your input in evaluating the executive director each year. Offer a pat on the back after a well done job on an event or a program or success. Again, just providing that ongoing support. Introducing them to community leaders. So if there's someone in your circle that you think your executive director should get to know to, expand support, get additional fundraising or just let them know about your organization. Make sure you introduce them to those people. Provide opportunities for them to speak or attend community functions. So if there is an event that you're going to in town, invite your executive director along, or if you are a member of a Rotary or other kind of group, invite the executive director to come speak at that so that they can share about the organization. Encourage time off to recharge. We want to make sure that they don't get burnt out, because that would, may lead to them leaving, and we don't want that to happen. Encourage attendance at trainings and continued education. So this is kind of goes along with that annual evaluation. If there are instances or areas where you think your executive director could benefit from additional training, make sure that you support them going to those additional training and getting that continued education. And then just finally offering support in both good times and in difficult times, because again, you are working together, the board and the executive director. Okay, the third item on the list of board members and related to the executive directors is evaluating the executive director. So why do we do this? Well, we want to take an opportunity to review the goals. And this should be both goals, big goals, overall goals of the organization itself and how the executive director is carrying those goals out, but also their personal goals as the executive director. Supporting growth for the individual. I think it just improves the overall relationship between the ED and the board. Providing a reward for work well done. So if your executive director is doing a really great job, you want to make sure that they are aware of that and that you show your appreciation. And then also, if for some reason there is poor performance where something is not being done correctly or not meeting the standards, you want to make sure that it is addressed to prevent that from an ongoing moving forward. So when we go through this evaluation of the executive director, normally it starts with a and you can do this different ways. This is just one way to do it. It usually starts with a self-assessment done by the executive director. And then the board will give their input. Sometimes the organization may include feedback from senior staff or direct reports of the executive director. If you do that, just make sure that all of the feedback, both the feedback from the senior staff and direct reports, is put together with the board of directors feedback. So that way it's more, so they're not singling people out. So it all comes together. Here is the feedback from all of the people that, that evaluated you. Needs to be done at least annually. So when we do this, first we want to start with a clear understanding of the criteria. So obviously, if you don't have something to base their work and what they're doing on, then it's kind of pointless to evaluate them. So this could be the job description. So obviously you should have a written job description for your executive director, what their responsibilities are. Also including, the organization's missions and goals, and then individual goals. Because the organization's missions and goals, the executive director is ultimately responsible for carrying those out day to day. And so that's why that's included. And then obviously as an individual, their goals as the executive director. Make sure that all board members participate. You want to make sure that you give feedback, provide goals for the next year, and then discuss results with the executive director. Again, it's pretty pointless if you go through this whole process and don't communicate the results to the executive director, because then they are not aware of, hey, you did a really good job, or hey, we really need to kind of focus more on this area. And that's part of the review process with the executive director, highlighting their strengths, where can we use this more, addressing the weakness. Okay, maybe we need a little bit more training in this area, or maybe we need to reevaluate how we're doing something, and then setting priorities for the coming year. Again, both for the whole organization and the executive director as an individual. When you're creating the evaluation, there's going to be multiple areas to evaluate, because obviously executive directors have a lot of different duties. They're not just normally in charge of fundraising or programming. Their administration, they're running the organization. They are going to have relationships with not only board members, but also out in the community. So, how are they doing that? Are they meeting getting involved in the community, going out there and making sure people are aware of your organization? Financial management, again, obviously you're going to have a CFO or an accountant that helps with that, but from a high level day-to-day operations, how is your executive director managing your financials? Fundraising, and then also goals for next year. You can do it a couple different ways, as far as, having various questions, and then, you can have the board members or whoever's evaluating you say exceeds expectations, meets expectations, doesn't meet expectation. But I think you should also add an option of don't know, because there are some instances where, as a board member, you might not be aware of how the person does interact or do a certain thing. So just make sure that is an option as well. Or you can use numbers 1 through 5. Just somehow you need to have some kind of evaluation done at least annually for your executive director that covers the different areas and responsibilities that they are expected to have, and then give feedback and meet with them in order to move forward in the best interest of both them and the organization. So when we do this evaluation, that's kind of in conjunction with the compensation that we're paying them. The IRS is very sees compensation of executive directors as a very high risk, very big area that they like to focus on. The IRS specifically says that a charity may not pay more than reasonable compensation for services rendered. If a charity does pay more than reasonable compensation, there is actually a penalty tax on the person who received the excessive benefits. The board members who approve the excessive compensation may also have to pay an excise tax. Now, I know in Indiana, and specifically we're at in Fort Wayne, there's probably not a lot of nonprofit executive directors that are making an excessive, what the IRS would determine to be an excessive compensation or benefits. However, we still need to follow the rules for determining compensation and make sure that that doesn't happen. So there are some requirements that the IRS has put into place regarding compensation for nonprofits. So specifically, the IRS encourages a charity to rely on the rebuttable presumption test. And there's a specific section and code to go to. But basically, it says that compensation payments are presumed to be reasonable if the compensation arrangement is approved in advance by an unauthorized body composed entirely of individuals who do not have a conflict of interest with respect to the arrangement. The authorized body obtained and relied upon appropriate data as to comparability prior to making its determination, and the authorized body adequately documented the basis for its determination concurrently with making the decision. So what does that mean? Okay, first of all, we need to have a group of people, whether it be your board of directors or you have a governor or an executive committee or an HR committee. You need to have a group of people who are knowledgeable in compensation matters, that have no financial interest in the determination, review and approve the compensation of your executive director. And that includes benefits as well. So that's the first piece. You also need to look at comparability data. So you need to look at compensation levels paid by similarly situated organizations for functionally comparable positions. So for example, if you are an organization that is in Fort Wayne, Indiana, you are probably not going to look at a nonprofit organization in California and compare your salary to their salary, because that just doesn't make sense. The salary rates are totally different. So that would not be similar. That would not be reasonable. Or if you have an organization that has a very small budget and you're trying to compare it to an organization that has, you know, a budget that's like 10 times what you have, that would not be comparable. So when you're looking at comparability data, you want to make sure that you're looking at an organization that does similar types of things that your organization does, similar size, and maybe in the similar type of geographic region. And then finally, we need to make sure that we have contemporaneous substantiation of deliberation and decision. So what that means is basically we need to document it. It really should be approved in advance of the actual payment. You need to document the terms and the date that it's approved. You need to document who the members are that were present when it was discussed. And then you also need to document what kind of comparability data was obtained and how it was obtained. So basically what you need to do for your salary and benefits that you're paying to your executive directors, you really should each year document, have a discussion with your board or executive committee, whoever's in charge of that. Document the discussion, look at comparability data and document that so that is approved for the year. So that way you meet the IRS requirements. Now, when you're looking at comparability data, one thing you might look at is the Northeast Indiana Nonprofit Salary Survey. So this is put out, I think every 2 or 3 years by the Community Foundation of Greater Fort Wayne, United Way of Allen County, and the Alliance for Human Services of Northeast Indiana. This survey covers 16 of the common leadership, administrative, and program positions within a nonprofit. The one in 2022 that I have here, it includes responses from 153 area nonprofits. And so this is one thing that you might look for when you're looking at comparability data. And you can go online and Google this and it will come up, and I can also send you a link as well. So you can see this is a page from the Northeast Indiana Nonprofit Salary Survey for the executive director, president, CEO, whatever you call them, your top person managing your everyday operations. And you can see here the base salary based on, the top line is the average minimum of all of the organizations that responded. And then you can also see the base salary by staff size and by budget. So you can utilize this to see, okay, where am I at? Comparable to these other organizations. Am I average? Am I minimum? Am I at the maximum? If you are above the maximum, you might want to kind of think why. But this gives you one resource to look at for that comparability data. In addition to the salaries, they also in the 2022 survey have benefits for executive directors, and these are specifically benefits that are different from all of the other staff. So 51% receive additional paid days off that the other staff don't get, cell phone allowances, those type of things. So you can also utilize this for looking at benefits when you're looking at comparability data. Another place that you can go is to Form 990. So if you want to look up other organizations, you can go directly to their Form 990. Here are some links that provide you the opportunity to look up those 990s. You can go to the IRS website. They recently started putting 990s out there. Candid, GuideStar, the organization might actually have it posted on their website as well. If the 990 was prepared properly, you can go to page 7 and you can see in this section, it should list all of the board of directors, but it should also list the executive director's name as well. And then in columns D, E, and F, you can see what the reportable compensation, salaries, and benefits were paid to that individual by the organization that year. So again, this is another place where you can go to look for comparability data. Just make sure you document what you used, whether it was the survey, whether it was the other 990s, to determine how you're making your compensation for your executive director. All right, next I want to talk about succession planning I know that this is a hot topic. There are a lot of organizations with executive directors that probably, I know, either recently switched over or are looking to retire in the next few years. So I think even if you do not have an executive director that is planning to retire, succession planning is really not just for retirements. You really need to start this the day that your executive director is hired. As part of the succession planning, it also develops current employees that may be able to fulfill the executive director role in the future. Or in case of an emergency, if your executive director has to leave for some unplanned absence, you want to make sure that you have someone able to fill in their duties. You need to document job responsibilities and duties. So these are just kind of some things to think about as you're getting started. If you don't, again, already have written job responsibilities, you need to put those in place. Determine responsibilities for a transition. So who, if for some reason the executive director has to leave, either short-term or long-term, who's going to take over those duties? Is it going to be, you know, your fundraiser, your COO? Who is it going to be? Your board chair? Who is going to take in those responsibilities for the transition? Because that's really what's most important about succession planning, is making sure that it is a smooth transition. You don't want to sever any kind of relationships. You want to make sure that your relationships with your funders, other nonprofits, other people you do programming with, that those are all maintained. And so that's what's really important about the whole succession planning. Maintaining an active board that includes succession planning in its strategic planning process. And then also there's probably going to be some additional cost involved when you bring in a new executive director, whether it be actually having to pay a recruiting recruiting firm, or, you know, paying them to have to travel to come interview or transition, move to the location. There's probably going to be some extra costs. And so you might want to be prepared for those as well. So we're going to talk about 3 different types of succession planning. Emergency succession planning, when, oh my gosh, the executive director left, we did not know anything about this. What are we going to do? Strategic leader development, and the departure defined strategy. And the latter 2 are more, you know, when it's going to happen, so you can be a little bit more prepared for it. So emergency succession planning focuses really on a backup plan for unforeseen circumstances in which the ED cannot fulfill its duties. So again, making sure that you have those written job descriptions and daily duties written down. Your executive director does a lot. Their job description probably has, you probably have a written job description in place that tells overall what they do, but they probably do a lot more during the day that's not written down anywhere. If something happens to them, you want to make sure that those duties continue to be completed. And so that's why we really need to have those documented. And that's really along with relationships, contacts. So making sure that you have a list of contacts. Okay, who's the organization's lawyer? Who's their accountant? Who's the insurance company? So you know all of these people, or somebody has a list. So if something were to happen, we have all of that documented as to who we need to notify for any kind of change. Emergency succession planning, we also need to address who is going to fulfill the role and for how long. And then also just overall, all organizations should have an emergency succession plan in place. Again, regardless if your executive director is super close to retirement, or if you just got a new one, you really need to have some kind of emergency succession plan in place. So when we talk about emergency succession planning, there could be 4 different instances. The first is temporary, unplanned, short-term. So in this instance, something happens, the executive director has to be away, they cannot fulfill their duties, but it's probably going to be less than 45 days. So maybe there's an illness, maybe there's a death in the family, but regardless, the executive director can't fulfill their duties, but they are going to plan to return. The second temporary unplanned absence is long-term. So again, the executive director is going to return, but they're just going to have to be away more than 45 days. And then the other two are more permanent. So a permanent unplanned absence. So something happened, we were not aware of it, we were not planning for it, the executive director is not going to return. Whether it was due to an accident, a death, maybe they won the lottery, moved to Hawaii, something happened, but they are not going to return. And then we have permanent departure. And when we talk about permanent departure, that really leads to some of the other planning that we're going to talk about. You really need to put in, it should include more of a complete plan, which we'll talk about next. But regarding the temporary unplanned absences, in this emergency succession plan document, which if you don't have one in place, we do have a template that we would be happy to provide. Just let us know if you'd like one. You really need to talk about who is going to take over for the executive director. You need to make sure that you tell that person that they are going to take over for the executive director. When the executive director is unable to do his or her duties and the other person steps in, what can that person do and not do? So for example, if the executive director is unable to fulfill their duties, a temporary replacement steps in, can that new temporary replacement sign new contracts? Can they add check signers to the bank accounts? Can they purchase a new building? Like what kind of things can they or cannot do? Or are they only supposed to be doing these responsibilities here? So that needs to be documented. Again, it's all about maintaining the smooth transition, maintaining those relationships within the organization so it doesn't impede on any programming or mission of the organization. So when we talk about more of the permanent type lead succession transition, the first one is the strategic leader development. So this focuses on identifying the next in line before the executive director has left. So let's say your executive director has said, okay, we think we're going to retire, or that maybe the executive director hasn't specifically said they're going to retire, but you know as a board that they're probably going to retire pretty soon. So we really need to identify who's going to step up and take over when they leave. This is really great because it allows for the development of a possible pool of candidates that have needed skills and knowledge. And again, at the beginning, when we talked about looking for specific skills that your organization needs at this time, this allows you to do that. Also, it allows the executive director to maybe help identify a successor and also transition those responsibilities. So the executive director is still somewhat involved during this transition and can train that new person on their responsibilities. And so it's kind of just a smooth, the old executive director is going out and the new one is coming in. So if you can do this type of transition, that's great. The next one is the departure defined strategy. So this is even better because your executive director has decided they're going to leave at a set date, and the set date is not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be next month. It's going to be a few years from now. So it's going to be, within 2 to 5 years. The organization doesn't normally publicly announce the executive director's intentions to leave. So the public probably doesn't know that when they're going to leave. But instead, internally, the board management is using the time to allow for this new transition. So they're doing a search behind the scenes for a new executive director without disrupting the operation. So from the outside, we're continuing as normal, programs, meetings, everything is going well. But just from the inside, we are getting ready for that transition to bring that new executive director in. And again, this provides an opportunity to focus on leadership strengths and finding the appropriate individual to lead the organization into the future. So again, looking for that person that is going to fulfill that role that you need as your leader within the nonprofit organization. So that's all that we have today. I know today's was a little bit shorter, but we just kind of wanted to touch on some of the key responsibilities of your executive director, the board versus the executive director relationship and how important that relationship is. And then also succession planning, because again, if you have not started or touched succession planning, you really need to start doing that with your board of directors, even if your executive director is not nearing retirement. So with that, I will turn it back over to Tyson.
All right, thanks, Carrie. Just as a reminder, this webinar was recorded. The slides and the video will be available on our website in the not-for-profit section. While you're on our website, make sure you sign up for next month's webinar. It's on July 13th. We're going to cover understanding the 990. Carrie's going to take a month off, and I'm going to present in July. Remember that our webinars are open to everyone, so feel free to share the links with people within your organization, your board members, or other people in the community. I want to thank everyone for joining today. Have a great rest of your day.